Something I really want to start doing is exploring strategy in more abstract ways. And that's why I was really excited to talk to today's guest. Nick Chater is Professor of Behavioural Science at Warwick Business School. He served on the advisory board of the Behavioural Insight team, as well as the British government's Climate Change Committee. And he's the author of The Mind is Flat. As I say to Nick, the book is slim but complex and challenging. Nick argues that what we think about at any one moment is all we are thinking about. There's no subconscious, no hidden thoughts or motivations or desires. There are only our sensory experiences, our memories of countless previous experiences, and our imagination in making sense of them all. It seems scary, but Nick argues that it's actually empowering. In our discussion today, Nick and I get into how best to decide on our ambitions and whether they'll actually make us happy, the tension between planning and improvisation, and the role that metaphors, cliches, and stories play in helping us make sense of our perceptions of the world. We also touch on our love of Frasier, artificial intelligence, how easily movies, TVs, and social media can shape our beliefs, and why everyone should be wary of any sudden revelations. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Nick Chater, thank you very much for being a guest.
Well, thanks very much. Lovely to be here.
I'm going to begin with my Inside the Actors Studio questionnaire. What is your favourite word?
Gosh, that is a good question, isn't it? I'm going to go for blueberry.
Nice. What is your least favourite word?
Oh, procrastination.
What is your favourite swear word?
Oh, gosh, that's a tough one. Perhaps bugger, possibly.
Nice. Did anything in your research for The Mind is Flat prompt you to use it?
Well, certainly the getting the permissions for the figures. That is a nightmare. So anyone writing a book, don't use any figures you haven't got permission for, because my goodness, that's a palaver.
What is a sound or noise that you love?
Well, I like the violin.
Nice. What is a sound or noise that you hate?
Scratchy chalk. I'm not the only one there.
No, it's a common answer. Do you have any guilty pleasures?
Yes, very fond of detective dramas.
Same. What is your favourite book?
Oh, that's difficult. Possibly Speak Memory by Nabokov.
And finally, and this also may dovetail with The Mind is Flat, is there a fictional character who you like to imagine yourself to be?
Well, I, not so much now, but as a teenager, very much Sherlock Holmes.
So since I was a kid, I've loved the show Frasier.
Me too. Yes.
I've watched it so many times over and over that I've kind of absorbed so much indirect knowledge of psychology that I'll sort of confidently say to myself, I could do that. But I thought I'd begin by asking what drew you to psychology and behavioural science?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I also am a keen fan of Frasier. In fact, as another guilty pleasure, my family often we watch an episode after supper. We have a quick episode of Frasier, and we did last night.
Anyway, favourite episode?
I don't know. There are so many, aren't there? Just full of great episodes. I very much like the episode where they're at the beach house and there's a dead seal. You'll know that very well, of course. That's very funny. Anyway, so many. Yes, why psychology? So I started off wanting to do some mathematics and philosophy, and I started off at maths at Cambridge as an undergraduate. Soon realised that I didn't really want to do maths, and indeed so mathematical logic was a thing thought I was very excited about. I've come a long distance since then, not necessarily in a positive direction, but anyway, in a long distance. So I started off thinking, I should focus on philosophy, switch to philosophy, then did a course as part of my philosophy degree on psychology as well as one of our options, and thought, wow, this is cool. So I then did the third year psychology, thinking I'd go back and do sort of philosophy with sort of knowledge of psychology as a background, but ended up in psychology, really, or cognitive science. So I suppose the thing I then went into, which was a kind of blend of maths and philosophy and psychology and other things, was this strange world of cognitive science where you're trying to build or think about how to build computational models of the mind, and that just seemed like an incredibly exciting thing to be doing. So that was that for me, and that's sort of what I do now, really. But thinking about behaviour, so thinking about cognitive science is you're looking at how the mind works, or you're trying to. The thing is, what's the machinery in the brain up to? But then that's a different level, really, from thinking about how do people actually behave as whole organisms. Like, how do we interact with each other? How do we buy and sell? How do we discuss things and come to conclusions and agreements and so on? And it's really, really sort of micro scale, and it's also individualistic. And I suppose over the decades, I've become increasingly interested in bigger and bigger scale things. So I'm now, a lot of my time is spent thinking about how does language evolve? How do people interact with each other? How does order emerge out of chaos in society in general? So I've become sort of more and more focused on big picture stuff as time's gone on.
I thought it was interesting that you're on the board of the behavioural insight team.
I was for a long time. Yes, that's right. Yes, indeed.
And I sort of stumbled on behavioural science about 10 years ago. It was like actually several months after I just finished managing a parliamentary election campaign. So I was very interested in the idea of persuasion and sort of everything like that. And then someone mentioned Inside the Nudge Unit. And I read it and I thought, this is... I never knew about this before.
I mean, that's very... I mean, David Halpern, obviously, who wrote that book, as you'll know, is a very, very impressive and interesting person. And it really has had a huge impact on introducing behavioural insights into UK governments. And one of the things I'm quite keen on stressing in that context is that the way the quote nudge unit works is very much broader than just focusing on nudges. So nudges are interventions which are trying to change individual behaviour in a way that is hopefully in a person's interest. So you're trying to get people to find the easiest thing to do, the thing that's actually best for them, rather than, as so often, as a marketer might want to do, to make the easy thing for you to do to buy their product, whether it's good for you or not. So the whole point of nudging is this sort of individual thing. But the behavioural insights team and behavioural insights in general is a broader thing than that, because of course human behaviour is important for all aspects of regulating and taxing and subsidising, and just everything governments do. We should be thinking all the time about the subtleties of human behaviour, rather than just thinking, well, we know how people work, we can assume they behave in a rational way, or assume they behave like I do. Sort of studying this a bit more carefully is important for all levels of government, not just nudges. But yes, I think that's also been... that's very influential on me too. I think for that whole movement got me very interested in the idea that we can really make a difference in changing how government policy is implemented and even planned in a way that didn't seem the case decades ago. It didn't seem possible that psychology would ever have any real relevance to how public policy was running. So that's quite an exciting development.
Your book, The Mind is Flat, is short but powerful and complex. I wondered if you could sort of give an overview of it.
Yes, I suppose the summary point is that the first sort of really basic point is that we have much less insight into our minds than we think. The truth of the way the mind works is that we're fantastically good moment-by-moment improvisers. So, for example, when you ask me questions about my favourite swear word or noise or whatever, it's not that I can think, luckily I know the answer to that one, because I just I have it ready in my book of all answers and Nick's sort of accumulated wisdom. It's not true at all. I have to sort of cook something up. And of course, now I've said it, if you ask me again, I'll think, oh yes, I said that. I know this one. I've answered this before, so I'll say the same thing. And so I may start to get locked into a pattern, and then I'll start to think, oh, that is truly my answer. Of course, I might give me a bit of a break and ask me again, and I'll probably think of something else.
I've, for technical reasons, I've had to interview some people a second time, usually because the first recording has got mangled or whatever, and they may forget what they said the first time around, and some have given me a different answer the second time around when put on the spot for one of those questions.
Yeah, because I think the improvisation point, I think, is very interesting, because we sort of know when you ask questions like those. So if the listeners will be thinking this too, I'm sure you're thinking, oh yes, what would my answer be? And most of the time, with questions like that, you don't really know what your answer is. You have to invent one. And I think the mind is flat starting point is saying, well, that's just always true. So if you ask me what product I want to buy, what's my favourite piece of music, do I want to do this or that? Do I believe this or that proposition? Do I support this or that party? I'm always having to do this improvisation. Now, if I've done that improvisation before, of course, sometimes I can think, oh, well, if you ask me, which party do I support? If I'm a very political person, I'm not, maybe I don't know, but if I'm very if I'm a party activist, then it's kind of obvious. Well, look, I've been working for this party for years. I guess it's pretty obvious I support it. So that doesn't feel like improvisation, because I've done the improvisation many times before, so you can get something locked in. But in general, you're continually having to create your answers as you go along, and I suppose that this has the inevitable consequence that the stories we create tend to be inconsistent. So just as the same person will answer the question about their most despised or most loved noise differently from time to time, then it's also going to be true if you ask people to justify consumer choices or political opinions, whatever it is. They're going to give you different answers. And they're also going to give you answers that don't really cohere together. So if you ask the same person sort of related questions, they'll drift off in different directions. They'll improvise away. And if you say, aha, so how does that all fit together? The answer will be, that's kind of tricky. I'm not quite sure, but it probably won't fit together. And I suppose an analogy I like to have in mind there is that it's a bit like the problem novelists have when they're writing. For example, you're writing about the layout of a city, and I think in the book I talk about Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast Castle, where there's lots of description of the layout of the castle, and people have tried to think, what does this actually look like? What's the plan? And the answer is, it doesn't make sense. There's just no way of figuring it out. Because, of course, in writing those descriptions, the novelist is just improvising their way from one situation to the next. They go, well, here we could have a giant hallway. Here we could have, an enormous, an underground passage leading off with passages in every direction. Here we could have some battlements, and describing how they're laid out in a way that's locally, moment by moment, seems so perfectly sensible. But if you try to put it all together, it just doesn't work. And the intuition that one wants to have in one's mind here is, I think, that instead of thinking, if I'm telling you about the layout of an imaginary city, or a layout of my beliefs, or the layout of am I thinking on anything at all, I'm creating this little sort of sequence of pieces of information, each of which, moment by moment, makes perfectly good sense. But just like the poor old novelist, if I then go back and think, how does that all fit together, then unless I planned it out carefully with diagrams and maps, it won't. And so we are inherently incoherent and inconsistent beings, and we're trying to be coherent and consistent. So we're continually finding ourselves thinking, oh, hang on, that doesn't seem to quite fit what I said over there. And some people care about this stuff more than others. Some people are trying hard to be consistent, some people aren't. But it's an impossible task. So we're sort of incoherent and inconsistent all the way through. So it's not as if you're going back to the sort of map analogy, it's not as if there is an inner map in the author's head, or indeed there's no inner map for my understanding of I live in the middle of Oxford. I don't have an inner map of Oxford. Oxford has all kinds of patterns in it. If you get people, there are interesting psychological studies of this, if you get people to draw little pictures of their neighbourhood or describe how the streets are laid out, they'll immediately come into these contradictions. There'll be all kinds of things that just don't join up. You just can't reconstruct anything because we just have this sort of local little bit patches of information which don't really fit together. They don't quite make sense. And I think that's a very different conception, I suppose, from the conception that I think So particularly policymakers and economists tend to have, because they think, people aren't perfectly, I don't perfectly understand their preferences or their understanding of their beliefs about the world, but broadly speaking, it's got to be coherent. So people are basically rational agents with a set of knowledge, a set of preferences, and they're going about their business trying to optimise those preferences given the knowledge they have, and that's broadly the story. And okay, they make the odd mistake. But I want to say, no, that's completely wrong. The idea that you have a stable set of beliefs about almost anything is totally wrong. It's an illusion.
Well, I'm sort of this coming Monday, I'm going to be interviewing Erez Yoli, who's the co-author of a book about game theory and how humans subconsciously optimize their gain. So it'll be an interesting contrast with this conversation.
Yes.
Yeah. So I found the book, it sort of challenged many of my beliefs about myself and the world, especially the idea that my beliefs aren't deeply held, but are just sort of improvised constructs. But what kept nudging me around was, I guess, your sort of overall argument that I think that what we think is sort of a combination of sensory experiences, memories of those experiences built up over time, and sort of imagination in processing them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then on the weekend, I listened to an episode of a great podcast called 99% Invisible.
I haven't listened to this. One of my daughters is a huge fan of 99% Invisible.
Well, it's really good, and there was a particular episode that weirdly it sort of came up, and I thought this would actually be great for this conversation. The episode's called "You Are What You Watch." A data journalist called Walt Hickey. His argument is sort of that about 20% of our waking hours each day is spent consuming movies and TV, and what we watch influences what we think about the world. And the main sort of example he uses is the war room in Dr. Strangelove influencing how people believe the architecture and interior design of important decision-making should look like. So when Reagan became president, he asked to be taken to the war room. And his idea of it was entirely based on Dr. Strangelove, and there wasn't actually any room in the Pentagon or the White House that looks like the war room.
Yeah.
And then also companies like Airbnb have built similarly designed war rooms. So that was his example of, that sort of sensory experience of taking in that content and that influencing, your belief. And then that kind of dovetailed with Frasier and how a lot of my knowledge of and confidence about psychology comes from repeated viewing of Frasier and not any kind of deeper sort of knowledge.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I think you are what you watch is a very interesting slogan. I like it a lot. So I think you're dead right that these things are connected. So I think the starting point. I think another way into this, which I think also dovetails with that, is thinking about how large language models work. So large language models weren't really a thing when I wrote Around His Flat, but they obviously are a thing now. And I don't think at all that large language models are human-like in a general way. But the way they operate, of course, is by hoovering. They are what they, as it were, read. And they read the whole web, and they distill it in an incredibly clever way. I'm truly astounded by what has been achieved. I never would have believed it possible. And I think my guess is that the people who did it didn't really believe it was possible either. It's just like emergent stuff has come out, which is just amazing. But they're very, very much driven by whatever you feed them, and so that they have a gigantic amount of memorized information. They'll know famous Shakespearean speeches. If you start them off, ChatGPT will complete them for you. It'll also go on. It'll go on after the speech is finished and burble in a vaguely Shakespearean fashion, nonsensically. But it has this vast corpus of actual, just concrete knowledge. And it's generalising sort of in a bottom-up way from that. So I think the way we work in general is very, very much from the specific to the general. So just as with the sort of picture of the war room you see in Dr. Strangelove or something, it's not that you start off with a general theory of every organisation must have some central location where the crucial decisions are made. It probably has to be organised like this so everybody can see lots of information on boards or screens or something. It's not that you have general ideas about this. You have some specific cases. And then when you think about a similar situation, so you think, well, that's the Pentagon, so let's think about a corporation. That will have one of these as well. And you might adjust it a bit because it's not going to have some missile locations on it. It's going to have something else. But the idea that you're working from these specific sort of sensory stream and verbal stream of information you've been processing and generalising up from that. But you're doing it in this piecemeal way. So think about ChatGPT or the visual models as well, the stable diffusion and so on. They're very good at building local models of reality, but they don't fit together either. So you can ask ChatGPT different questions and you'll catch it out instantly. If you ask it a variety of questions in different ways, it will say things which are contradictory. And that, of course it does, because it's no more likely to be consistent than the web is. I mean, the web is full of people saying all kinds of contradictory things. It does a pretty good job, but it's fundamentally working from the sort of sensory experience upwards, rather than having I think we often have this sort of sense, and academics in psychology and economics and elsewhere have this sort of intuition that we must start from this kind of inner theory of how the world works, or as it were, a map of the territory, a set of principles. And therefore, consistency is kind of guaranteed. You've got the principles or the map, and you just read off your answers. Whereas we should be very much more thinking, we just have these experiences, we interpret them. And if you think, does the interpretation of this one fit with the interpretation of that one? Well, in general, no. And that's a job for sort of reflective thought and endless confusion. So I suppose I'm trying to also tap into our intuitive sense that we're always skating on thin ice. I mean, I think we all have this feeling that we don't quite understand what we're talking about, and we're kind of muddling from one sentence to another. And I think we should take that quite seriously, and not as a sign of our daftness, and sort of thinking, my goodness, everybody else knows what they're talking about. It's just me just blundering from sentence to sentence. But it's actually the magic of human intelligence is that we don't have to have a full model of the world. And if we did, we wouldn't be able to function because the world's way too complicated. But luckily, we are very good skaters. So we can sort of navigate our way from one situation to another, more or less holding it together.
Well, so my mum asked me last night who I was interviewing today. So I sort of explained sort of the mind is flat. And she was a bit frightened of it as my rough explanation. She didn't like the idea that say being a good person might be not something deeply rooted in herself, and it's just a construct. And so I was sort of thinking, like, what sort of pushback have you had, or what misconceptions have you felt you've had to correct on it?
Well, I think it's one of those things that is quite a rattling way to. It does rattle people a lot. So some people think, "Wow, this is amazing and weird," but I love it, and others feel this is really weird and I don't like it at all. And I think one of the reasons people feel that is a sense of things like sort of ethical sort of thoughts, thinking, well, I have these principles and I'm a good person. I live by these precepts, and that's sort of how wired into me, and I'm fully consistent in that regard. And I would say, but another strand of objection is coming from people who are very committed to the unconscious or subconscious from a sort of psychotherapy point of view. So they want to say, if you think that what you're doing in therapy is uncovering people's unconscious, then I want to say, well, this is a fiction. It's just the surface. But the surface. So for me, I'd like to reassure both those sets of people by saying, well, the thing is, this process of skimming the surface from, as it were, one momentary thought to another, dealing with the sensory information and the words that are coming at you, and your memories and your imagination, this process is always, first of all, it's self-feeding in the sense that my current thoughts are going to shape my future thoughts. If I going back to political allegiances, if I spend time and energy and just thinking power about the wonders of Party A, I'll probably be with Party A again. So it's not like I'm completely all over the place. And that will be true for moral things too. So if you spend a lot of time trying to work for some good cause, quite likely in the future you'll also care about it. But on the other hand, people are full of contradictory behaviour when you take them from one context to a radically different one. And so we're all familiar with people who are tremendously kind to one person and very unkind to another, possibly inadvertently. I mean, Frasier itself is full of cases where Frasier's pompously declaring how he's incredibly helpful to almost everybody and thinks of no one but himself, and in the very next second he's doing the opposite. And that's very human. We do that all the time. And again, we're continually struggling with the fact that our different aspects of our lives and different interactions with different people, we're behaving in slightly contradictory ways. So another thought, I guess, to try and reassure people is to say, think of yourself, think of your integrity as a human. And this is the thing that, again, people worry about. They think, well, what I am is all about these things, these values I hold, and so on, and for that matter, beliefs. And I want to say, no, think of yourself much more as coming from your history. What makes you you are the things you've thought and done. And that's what makes you different from other people. It's not that we can do a personality test and say, this is you, here you are on these scales, and that makes you special, or here are your moral values on some psychometric questionnaire. I'd want to say, no, it's way richer than that. The thing that makes me, and you is this vast repertoire of things that we've thought and done. And they will shape the way we improvise in the future. So we're like jazz musicians who are all improvising away, but they're improvising differently from each other because they've got this history of different improvisation. So you can't just think, I'll throw away my current improvisational tendencies and I'll just magically improvise like Charlie Parker, who's a great saxophonist. You can't do that. And if you could, how great that would be. But on the other hand, you improvise in your own special way, and you can also change that. So it's not as if you're sort of locked into a kind of inextricable sort of web of your own construction. I mean, it's hard to inevitably our future thoughts and future actions are going to be built on patterns of thinking that we've built up already. But we could also actively change those and think, hang on, that's a silly way to think. Let me think more positively, or let me do a gratitude journal or something like this, where you suddenly spend more time thinking, there are quite a lot of good things in life, and that will, those things can change people's. By changing your style of thinking, this is what cognitive therapy, of course, is all about. That can change how you think in the future. So I don't think it really undermines people's sense of personal integrity. And I think, in fact, it gives us, I'd like to think it gives us a richer sense of why we're all different.
That kind of touches on my definition of strategy is that it's achieving your ambitions as stuff outside your control tries to stop you. And I sort of felt like the mind is flat was relevant to each part of that definition. Mm-hmm. Like something I'm really interested in strategy making is how best to decide a goal or an ambition, how to make sure it's the one that you actually want to work towards. Have you read the Chekhov story Gooseberries?
I don't think so, no.
So it's a really great short story about a guy who has a dream about he wants to own a manor house in the country with a gooseberry bush, and he can eat the gooseberries, and that's his dream. And so he restructures his entire life to try and achieve that goal and save enough money. He marries a rich widow and then sort of miserly controls the finances, and the wife dies because she's no longer living in the life she's come accustomed to, and he's just getting as much money as he can, and he buys a dilapidated manor house beside a factory that's polluting the river and the soil. But it's a manor house, and it's got some gooseberry bushes, and the story ends with him eating the gooseberries from the bush and crying because he's achieved his dream, even though the gooseberries taste disgusting because they're full of toxic from the local factory. But he's done it, and so I've always been interested about like how do you settle on what you want your ambition or your goal to be. And I felt that story dovetailed with a story you include in the book about Bertrand Russell deciding he didn't love his wife anymore.
Yes.
And sort of basically radically altering his life as a result of something he believed was a long buried belief. But actually, it could have been something completely different.
Yeah. So the Russell story is an interesting one because, as you say, he has this momentary flash of thinking he doesn't love his wife Alice. And then, he upends his life completely. Not instantly, but basically unravels the marriage and changes his life completely. And has this, for him, it's a feeling of it bursting through from the unconscious. And I think we should be really suspicious. It doesn't mean that maybe that was the right thing to do, who knows. But I think we should be really suspicious of that sort of sense of that sudden revelation. Because sudden revelations come in all shapes and sizes and can be quite contradictory to each other. So I think it's always we should be very cautious about anything where we think, here comes the honest, unvarnished truth, because look, I feel very emotional as I think it or as I say it. And similarly, of course, when people have arguments, so you have arguments with each other, particularly in relationships, people will sometimes say something, you think, well, that's it, that's what you really thought all along. And that's, again, a very dangerous way of thinking, because if you think that there's a possibility that rather than being a sort of massive contradictory thoughts and feelings, and the improvising machinery is blurting out things to have a particular rhetorical effect, which might be just to sort of fight back against feeling cornered. If you start to think that there's a sort of an unvarnished and clear truth lurking in there, which might break out at any moment, and that was it there, then you might indeed uproot your relationship or life in a drastic way, which may be entirely inappropriate. So I think, but yes, this question of how to set goals, I think it is very difficult, and I think it is an iterative process. So I think it can't be right, and I suspect this sounds like it aligns with your thinking about this. It can't really be right to think the first thing I'm going to do is think of my goal, and I'm going to keep that stable, and I'm going to now think how I'm going to get there. Because as you think about how you might be going to get there, you might start to think, oh, actually, maybe this goal isn't quite right. I need to revise it. So in the case of the gooseberry case, you might think, well, it's all about having a manor house with gooseberries. But then you might find yourself thinking, yes, but actually, now think about it, and the gooseberries have got to be tasty, unpolluted gooseberries. And maybe I can't afford a manor house. Maybe there's a small cottage would be fine. Or maybe I can get some gooseberries from a neighbour, or who knows. But as you start to think about the end goal in the abstract can lead you to do some very sort of distorting, things that distort your life on the way. And I suppose it's always important to be able to think as you're going along, well, hang on, maybe that wasn't the right goal. Let's update. Every part of the chain can be changed, I think.
Well, I mean, a lot of my thinking on this was influenced by another behavioural scientist, Paul Dolan.
Yes.
And I remember reading one of his books and sort of thinking about how, like, you can't know you will be happy as a billionaire because you don't know what it's like to be a billionaire day to day. You can only know what you experience in the moment or what makes you happy in any passing moment. So if you have an idea of owning a manor house with gooseberries, how best to create that in a small way now to give you an idea of whether it would make you happy or not. And so a lot of that influenced my thinking of like how best to think that any kind of ambition you set on is one that is worthwhile in the end, sort of justifying all the work for.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, and I completely agree that thinking about making things as concrete as possible and sort of as embedded in sensory as possible, so that thinking concretely what's it like to live this life, or what's it like to live the life that will get me there. So I think because really our lives are this sort of improvised scramble through sensory experience and interaction with other people and all the things we watch and so on. If this is what a life is, so it's the thing you want to really be optimizing is that that it's the journey. I mean, it's the journey. It's a kind of tired and hackney thing, but the journey is the thing. So if you just focus on the goal, you're kind of making a mistake, because once you get to the goal, you've still got to do some journeying, because life just is this inherent flow through experience. So what's that flow going to be like? So it might be you're sitting there with your gooseberry bush, even if the gooseberries are tasty, alone in your manor house, thinking, well, sort of sounded good in the abstract, but I haven't really got anything to do anymore. So I think one of the things I'm quite keen on is for people to think to themselves, not so much where do I want to be in life, although that is not a trivial thing. I think these long-term visions are important, but also to be thinking, when you're thinking about that, how do I want to spend my day? Just what do I want to do when I sort of get up in the morning? What kind of things do I think, oh, this is fun, or well, I don't like this very much? And just thinking about the kind of, and I think we do this surprisingly little. I think there are lots of us, and probably myself included in many periods in my life, who are not focusing all that much on thinking, what is the most worthwhile and enjoyable way to flow through the world? I've only got sort of 80 years of it, so I may as well enjoy doing it and do things that I think are worthwhile. And yet, but often we're not thinking at that level of, what are the things I want to... Do I want to, for example, once upon a time I commuted to London daily. It's very hard to think of your life. Maybe some listeners will think, oh, commuting is not so bad. You have a podcast. Maybe that's right. But for me, it was pretty horrendous. And when it stopped, I can remember the last few weeks thinking, oh, will it stop? I can't bear it anymore. Because I'd obviously really been trying to convince myself it wasn't that bad. It was absolutely fine. But the experience of just, that for me, and not for everybody, but for me, the kind of the battering experience of ploughing into London with delayed trains and tubes which are jam full of time, that was really difficult. So it's all very well being at University College London, which is like an amazing institution, tremendously exciting place to work. But it's just a battery. Do you want to be battered like that? And some people will not find it very battering, but the thing is to reflect on the flow of experience, not just the apparent sort of big picture, exciting job in an exciting city.
Another aspect of the mind is flat that I sort of felt was relevant to strategy is I sort of believe that strategy, like the practice of it, is sort of a spectrum. And on the one end, it's very deliberative. There's a lot of forethought, a lot of planning, sort of big picture thinking. And then on the other end, it's more sort of reactive and instinctive. And it's almost like a chain reaction in your mind of thinking like ends, ways, means, actions, just all within milliseconds. And something that struck me when I was reading The Mind is Flat is that story about the chess master who played 100 games simultaneously, and used to argue that his skill was the result of memories of countless previous games that he played before, combined with an ability to rework and reimagine them. And I sort of felt that sort of captured what I've been trying to articulate about a sort of instinctive, reactive strategizing.
Yeah, I think these things are much closer to perception than we tend to imagine. So when you sort of try and recognise what's in front of you, that's an immensely difficult calculation. And it takes enormous amounts of computing power to do it with AI, and our brains do it very, very, very efficiently and quickly. But we do it, of course, because we've done a lot of this before. So we're taking our past experiences and thinking, I've seen a lot of dogs. Well, that image there, it's not quite like any of them, but it's sort of similar. And there's a bit of a tree in the way, and it's a slightly different breed, but it's moving in a way that's sort of familiar. So you can map all those previous perceptual experiences into the experiences of the moment, and you do it very, very quickly. And your brain is doing all of this without any conscious experience at all. In fact, I think I want to stress that conscious experience is slow and sequential, so you're really only really aware of one thing at a time, and thoughts go around in a kind of cycle of, I'm now focusing on this, and now focusing on this, and now focusing on this, in a very, very, very slow and sequential fashion. But the machinery, of course, that's generating those thoughts is incredibly powerful and complicated, and you're taking in vast amounts of information to do it. So there's the machine, there's the 100 billion neurons. If you ask yourself, how's that machinery working? The answer is you have no idea. But whatever it's doing, it's not doing anything like it's not going to look anything like those conscious thoughts any more than if you, to go back to ChatGPT, you could say to ChatGPT, why did you give that response? And it'll say something. But the truth about why it gave that response is buried in its case, billions and billions of artificial neurons interacting in a massively complicated way. ChatGPT isn't looking that up. It's not thinking, oh, hang on, let me just look at my all that calculation I just did. It hasn't got a clue. But what it can do is can cook up a story, and so we're always able to cook up stories about why we do things, including why. If you say, how did you know it was a dog? I can say, oh well, the wiggly tail and the eyes. But that happened far quicker than any of that. And it's the same with I think something like strategizing too. When you start to think, suddenly it's becoming clear, I can see how to do it. That pattern, it's almost certainly coming from patterns of planning and strategizing you've done before. You think, I kind of know this. I know this kind of how you do this kind of thing. It's suddenly becoming clear to me. And so I get this from time to time when you're designing experiments. You can think, how on earth do we study this? And then suddenly, gradually, you have a sense of, I'm beginning to see it. And then you have the feeling of, I've got it now. Now, it's not actually, I think, the case that all of a sudden all the pieces have fallen into place. It's more a case of, I'm close enough now that I can kind of, as I look at the different bits of the problem, I think, I know that I'm going to be able to solve this one because it's familiar. I know how to do this. And then you put it together and then you do the next bit and then you do the next bit. And so it's not quite that the whole thing comes to you in a single flash, but you're drawing on those past experiences and you're getting to the point, as the chess master will be too, that getting to the point where they think, well, I can't see the whole rest of the game, but I can see that if I do this, I can see vaguely where we're going, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to win. So that's that point of thinking, it's under control now, I've got it. But I think that sense that we have I think there are occasionally these slightly loopy sounding claims that people will say, at a single moment, the whole symphony flashed into my mind. I think this is almost invariably a mistake, or it's an illusion. But it's not. But it's picking up something real. It's picking up some sense of, now this is a familiar territory. Some thought has occurred to me that means that from now on I kind of know what I'm doing. Now it's going to be easy, and I can just write out the rest of the symphony, or pin down all the rest of my plans.
The sort of second season of this podcast kicked off with an episode about James Bond and strategy. Me and my guest, Paul Klein, was sort of saying that this spectrum of strategy, Bond films are usually about the conflict between them. The Bond villain usually comes up with the fiendish, complex, well thought out plan for world domination. And James Bond is kind of the instinctive, reactive strategist who just sort of knows. And then last week I was revisiting The Mind is Flat and this point about the chess master. And I sort of thought, is the reason why James Bond is such a good instinctive strategist is that because he's foiled so many plans for world domination that as each new one comes along, he just sort of had an intuitive sense about how to foil the next one?
Well, I think that would be, that's a rather nice thought, yes. I think it will be, of course, in real, if there were such a person as a real James Bond, they'd had lots of experience of foiling plans, and they'd also have vast amounts of training, and they could be continually thinking about, what would happen if this and that, and what would I do then? And so there'd be all this kind of mental rehearsal, and actual sort of practice in a kind of safe sandpit environment. And that's how people really learn things. They spend, but yes, that process of really, as it were, playing the game. It's like if you're thinking about something like tennis, which evolves extremely quickly over a period of a minute or so. About a long rally would be a minute, but there's enormous. You could view it as a very strategic thing. So we're playing this drop shot, and then the obvious responses are lob and so on. But of course, none of that is going through consciously through the minds of the player, because it's all having happened so quickly. But of course, the reason they can do it is they've played lots and lots of these games before, and the more you've played, in fact, you have to play it vast amounts of times to both create and implement the strategy, sort of without any delay or apparent thought. But of course, in practice, it's a very, very rich, complicated strategy you're playing out. And I think it also relates to this generally very interesting question about the degree to which you can pre-plan, isn't it? I mean, you've got your villain with their sort of global master plan, and Bond hasn't really got any particular plan apart from I've got to foil this villain. And I think with different objectives and different situations, that kind of big grand plan can be effective, and you may sometimes need it. But equally, the sort of improvised, well, let's really kind of moment by moment. Well, don't know quite what I'm trying to achieve, but I know that I've got a general sense that world takeover by this evil villain is bad. But beyond that, I'm just kind of winging it. I mean, I think a lot of strategy. I mean, we don't like to think of strategy as sort of well practiced winging it, but I think to some extent it has to be like that.
Well, I mean, a few years ago, I did an interview with Lord Peter Ricketts, the former National Security Advisor. It was about his book Hard Choices, and he was sort of generally arguing that the British government needs to be more strategic in its foreign policy and its defence policies, and sort of politicians by nature aren't strategic. And my sort of counter was politicians are/can be strategic about politics. They just don't seem to be able to translate it to foreign policy or anything else. So they're forever acting in the moment of like, how does this event, how does that decision affect me winning election 4, 3, 2 years from now? So they're constantly practicing strategy in the moment, almost instinctively. And it's pure, or that sort of Bond-like instinctual reactive belief in what they need to do, not the sort of sitting back thinking 4, 5, 10 years ahead about that.
Yeah, and I think it's a very interesting point that you could be strategic from different perspectives, can't you? So you may be very strategic thinking, if I don't do this thing right now, that will my reputation will be damaged, and that will affect my future career. So you can have that you can be behaving in a way that's sort of relevant to your long-term goals, but those may not be the goals that, if we're looking from the outside and thinking, yes, but is this what the country needs to defend itself in the best possible way? That may not be strategic with respect to those goals, but then in some sense you're not. Those aren't the goals that, if you're an elected politician, you're necessarily being trained on, as it were. You're being trained on a continual feedback on how you're getting on with your sort of electoral prospects. How's your reputation within the party, and these sorts of things. So we are. I mean, this is again the localness point, that we can't underestimate the improvised and local nature of our experiences and challenges we face. So if you think what politicians are trying to do most of their day, actually literally how they spend their time, they're spending their time doing a lot of things most of which aren't about decision making at all. They're about sort of producing compelling narratives and persuading people and becoming liked and building relationships and so on. And then they get good at this. But if you then say, yes, but how are you getting on with thinking strategically about the direction of the country? There will be exceptions, but for many of them, well, that's kind of not what they do day in, day out. That's just a different thing. Having said that, there are exceptions. There are some obviously very, very thoughtful politicians, but if that's not, it's just not the main task. I think the thing people are good at are the things they spend all their time doing.
This kind of touched on the sort of final aspect of why I thought the mind is flat is relevant to strategy, which is the point you sort of make about how we sort of all the century information that we're getting, the use of metaphor and story in trying to make sense of it all. And a friend of mine coined something I do as Aaronisms, which is when it comes to, say, practicing strategy or something like that. I love history. I studied history. I'm always reading history books and everything like that. So wherever my personal experience falls short on a situation, I will do what my friend calls Aaronisms, where I'll go sort of, this particular negotiation reminds me of the time that Cardinal Richelieu,
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, and There's also there was a really interesting interview Rory Stewart did with David Cameron's former communications director, Andy Coulson, where he was talking about crisis management by cliche when he was in a compound under attack in Iraq. He was thinking about how I'm the captain of the ship and I need to go down with the ship and everything like that. And sort of his responses were a cliche that was divorced from the actual situation he was in. But that was a way of like trying to process what was going on.
Yes, I mean, I think that's very true. So the thing about the fact that we're improvising our way from one moment to the next is that we're always going to try and draw on past experience. And those experiences will be sometimes quite different from the situation we're currently in. So if I'm looking at one dog, try to recognise the dog, or recognise its breed, then past experiences of similar dogs they'll come to mind whether I want them to or not, and that will be very helpful. But these more abstract, this works at every level of abstraction. So having a situation where I'm under attack, or we're in danger of disaster, then we will immediately find ourselves thinking of an analogous sort of metaphors, which may sound cliched, like yes, we are. This is like I'm the captain of the ship. I've got to go down with it. I can't just run off. And I think that tendency to continually process the world in terms of snippets. I mean, we process life as we go along in a story-like way. We're telling ourselves stories about, well, I did this and they did that, and that made me think this. And so there's a kind of story-like, a narrative-like structure to our everyday experience and our dreams and so on. Not necessarily a perfectly coherent one, and that's what we're going to be drawing on. And I think actually doing this is often very helpful. So the kind of obviously which metaphor or bit of history or cliche you draw on is going to potentially radically affect you. So if you think this is like this is a case of appeasement, as in Chamberlain, but whatever situation you're in, if you think that, then you're going to be thinking, right, well, we both can't do that, then that's got to be bad, we've got to stand up. But obviously there'll be some other historical analogy you might take instead, and then you come to the opposite conclusion. So which narrative we naturally reach for is very important. And also, of course, thinking about persuasion, then it's very obvious to anyone with exposure to politics that the choice of narrative is going to be absolutely crucial. So you're trying to persuade by essentially saying you've got a narrative about this already, and this is past shared experience where we all agree the situation we're in now is like that, and the trick for great persuaders is that they make that analogy seem compelling.
My last point was sort of going to be about like the thing that's sort of most worried about me about sort of the mind is flat is sort of you share the story about an experiment where sort of voters were given a survey with an American flag on, which nudged them sort of Republican, and then there was signs that those people went on to vote more Republican to be consistent with past behavior, and it sort of frightened me away of like, could I be so easily swayed from what I believe is my deep moral convictions? But you also make a point in the book that that's not so easy. That actually there are the memories that you also have counteracting that.
Yes.
And then also the fact that precisely because they're not deeply held things, you can just as easily switch back as well with the right.
Yeah, exactly. And that flag experiment is an incredible experiment. I mean, the effects are relatively small, so it's not that deep, really, really strong Democrats are suddenly becoming Republican. But of course, all those people on the margins, and there are quite a lot of them, they are filling in the survey, being nudged in the Republican direction by the flag, only a little. But then, of course, if they're thinking, I think that's Republican. And of course, then they're going to remember that later. So it's that kind of, but that's that kind of little tweak, little nudge is, our lives are sort of a compound of many of those. But on the other hand, as you say, we have lots of, we're completely improvising our thoughts as we go along through our entire life. And we're trying to knit these things together. So if one particular nudge pushes us in a direction that seems incompatible with our wider beliefs, we won't just go ploughing straight ahead. So it's only if you're actually on the margins, if you're politically unsure, then some memory which says, well, I've thought about this before and I decided I'd vote Republican, I guess, maybe I will. Then there's nothing pushing in the other direction because you're not really sure anyway. But if you have a very strongly held set of sort of prior thoughts which work against that, then it's not gonna sway you. So I don't think we shouldn't feel we're completely in the play of sort of whatever nudge comes along. But equally, we shouldn't underestimate the power of the sort of the fire hose of information that we encounter. So if somebody controls a social media channel, not entirely hypothetically, who has a particular agenda, then if you expose yourself to that social media channel for long enough, it's actually it's going to be difficult to resist it. Your views may start to shift. So we need to be careful. We need to be careful what we expose ourselves to, because those compound of all those different prods and nudges will shape us to some degree.
Nick Chater, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron. It's been a real pleasure.
I want to thank Nick again for amazing conversation. If you enjoyed it, like, rate, comment, if you would be so kind. If you want to buy The Mind is Flat and support independent stores in the UK, check out the Strategy Hour and Bookshop page in the show notes. I hope you all tune in again next week.